Welcome back to the Politics and Society podcast, Marv. It's been a while. Welcome back.
Alright, yeah, it's been good, yes. It's been a while indeed.
Yeah, yeah. How's life anyways? All good?
Yeah, it's grand, yeah.
Tipping away.
Usual stuff.
Right, I think since the last time we were on, we have missed quite a bit, but now we're down to 3 candidates, and last night we had our debate, so I think that's a good place to start. What do you make of the debate last night between Catherine Connolly, Heather Humphreys and Jim Gavin?
Dull, in general. Kind of nothing really stands out too much, it was a bit of a... Yeah, nothing really missed, I think, kind of... the only thing that surprised me really was how poor Humphreys was. I was kind of taken back at how I thought I was expecting a bit better from her, but I think I always knew Connolly was going to get her message out very well, and I just knew Jim Gavin was just going to choke, I just, yeah, so, but nothing headline grabbing, I think, in general.
Oh, no, not at all. And as we were saying off camera, you're better off listening to this podcast than watching an hour and 10 minutes of it. It's an hour and 10 minutes we'll never get back. But that's the nature of the beast, really, isn't it? But yeah, I'll even start off on Catherine Connolly and talking about kind of the foreign policy. A big topic, obviously, because they are the head of state, is going to be kind of Gaza and Ukraine and stuff. And Connolly was criticising Gavin early on. Now, nobody really locked horns, to be fair, but this was kind of the early one, kind of talking about, Israel's military objectives had been met. So, there was a little bit there, and I was kind of, to be fair to Gavin, I know, I'm using my hands here, but he was kind of using the hands a lot as it got
Harry
on,
Potter,
and you could see he wasn't, literally, he wasn't really comfortable in that setting, but what do you make of let's say how he dealt with that kind of criticism early on, talking about the military operation? And I know Connolly herself was kind of criticised earlier on for her BBC interview as well.
Yeah, well, he came out quite strong and on that, I suppose, and he was using this. He was saying, I'm a former member of the Defence Forces, and I've wore the tricolour and all that. So I think that's where the angle he was coming from. I think she handled it well. Now, the only thing I would say is she had to be kind of I don't think she herself used the kind of said Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think Kieran Cuddihy had to actually use that phrase. So I think that's the big thing that she gets criticised for. They say, oh, she's too soft on Russia, that kind of thing. But she is on record condemning the invasion. It's not that she's pro Putin or anything like that. But I do think she's the strongest candidate in terms of articulating support for neutrality, even though the other two candidates did. But again, because they're linked to the government parties, and the government parties are being alleged as being soft on neutrality, or indeed of the current definition of neutrality, I think that's definitely a feather in her cap. And indeed, when we look at Jim Gavin, and he said about how I don't represent the government, and it's kind of you kind of do. You've been nominated by the Taoiseach, you know what I mean? But yeah, no, I think she dealt with it well enough. Nothing new came out anyway, but I think she articulated her points pretty well,
Yeah, it was Kieran Cuddihy's really good at trying to trip up people, and you could see Gavin was kind of getting out of his comfort zone as it got on, and I served 20 years here, I did this, I did that. It was the CV every time. How are you going to be a president? I served this, I served that. It was. You could fast forward any point in it, and Jim Gavin would start off with the same. It seemed very rehearsed and seemed quite unnatural, not organic in that sense. But one thing which I did like was, even first impressions are everything, and Catherine Connolly straight out the bat with the Irish,
The Gaeilge, the Cúpla Focal.
Cúpla Focal, yeah. So she's getting her foot out there, and I saw Heather Humphreys using a little bit as well after, so, but I know what you're meaning, and I think it's very interesting as well that, even to do with housing is going to be a big issue, especially for us young people, and Heather Humphreys and Jim Gavin are going to be dragged down on that, especially Heather Humphreys, because it was her coalition governments that were involved around this time of that housing crisis, which Catherine Connolly did highlight and mention time and time again, and I thought she had a great way of projecting that. She talked about 2016, that was when the crisis started, when she entered office. I loved the way she also mentioned about the local governments know, that's close to my heart, and how the local
It is.
governments have been despecialised. You know, I spent a long time studying that, but it always seemed to be kind of like Connolly was in control and she was just the most comfortable out of the three, most definitely.
It's kind of, you know, I'm sure the last time we were talking about this, like, I think, what's her face, Mairead McGuinness was still the Fine Gael candidate.
Mm.
And then, you know, she dropped out, and then Heather Humphreys came in. And, like, I do think Heather Humphreys I think she's a solid candidate, but the big problem with her is that because she was in cabinet for so long, and thanks to the constitution and its rules on collective cabinet responsibility, that means that she is equally accountable for everything that the government has done since she was in office, both the good and the bad. That's the way it works. So she's very well open to being criticised for anything to do with the housing crisis. I know we had a go at her about the safety of Dublin streets, that kind of thing. And like, she left it open herself in her open remarks. She talked about how, oh, I served in cabinet for 11 years. So she left it open for invitation there. But she seemed to mention at one point about 3D printing houses or something like that. It seemed a bit like,
Yeah.
I was just shocked with the gaffes, and then she kind of made a bit of a remark about the occupied territories bill, that a bit off the cuff, that looked a bit like, Asher, why would he be passing that? What difference would that make? But no, actually, what I mean is, I would be in favour. I don't know. She seemed a bit more gaff prone than I was expecting. Again, I was expecting it out of Gavin, you know, completely untrained. I don't know what the Taoiseach was thinking, being honest with you, but Humphreys I was quite surprised with.
Yeah, you know what I actually think is quite interesting when you look at what they're actually saying in their opening remarks and their closing remarks. And Heather Humphreys is really trying to, not only they're all kind of using unity, especially Humphreys and Gavin, but she's talking about like putting out the hand of friendship and communities, and she's trying to build like that. I think it's really interesting because we're at that kind of point where we've had a president for 14 years who has used his platform to talk about, you know, international issues, and, you know, he's speaking on behalf of the Irish people for the, like, Gaza and Ukraine and stuff like that. Is it going to be the same with Catherine, or is it going to be like this kind of new kind of people's person in Heather Humphreys, who she's saying she's rural, she's there, she's for the community, stuff like that. So
Yeah.
I think that's actually quite interesting to see the way that kind of pans out. And over the next 4 weeks, they're really going to have to prove to the people, like, why should you vote for me? Now, I don't really feel like anyone really got that point across in this debate as to why you should vote for me over this person, you know?
It's kind of, yeah, I think they're just trying to get their just central messages out. But like Jim Gavin, I am slating him here because, you know, he just seems very like gaff prone and scripted. But like, he's definitely been doing his homework since he first announced his candidacy, because he was coming out with all sorts, and that's why Catherine Connolly was pressing him on the, you know, have Israel achieve their military objectives, because that was something that he himself said about 3 weeks ago in an interview with Gavin Riley. So I think he's been a bit more careful with what he is actually saying. I think sometimes when he's being questioned, I think he can kind of get caught, you know, talking about how, oh, I walked down O'Connell Street and I'm fine, and no one's ever had a go at me. But apparently there was some American quarterback that got jumped in Temple Bar or something like that. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, I don't know. Again, like, I wasn't really too surprised with anything, being honest. But I mean, like, if I was a Fianna Fáil backbencher TD, I'd actually be, I don't know what I'd be thinking. I'd be looking at that thinking, I think Billy Kelleher would have done a good job there. That's probably what I would have been
Absolutely.
thinking.
And you even see Billy Kelleher like in the news, just going around with the community. He's a personable man. He's natural, you know. He just has that kind of charisma that you need as a
Yeah,
president. And I don't feel that like any candidate has really, like, I think we've three candidates, two in particular, who were like elected representatives for quite a while, and Catherine Connolly has a good CV, as does Heather Humphreys, but I just feel like we're lacking that leader, you know, that kind of.
yeah. And it's like, particularly with like Kelleher, like, he was sent out to bat on RTE for Fianna Fáil, like, yeah, about 2012 and all, when their name was absolute dirt, you know. And he was, so like, he's well used to being pressed for questions and on television. Like, that's where I remember him from before he went to Europe. So yeah, just like, I don't know. I just think it's a bit. I don't know what's it. We'll find out more, I suppose, over the next couple of months and years as to what actually happened there. But I think he was the natural choice, you know. And
Yeah.
and And even there with Gavin, like he was saying that, like, oh, like, I'm not a politician, maybe this is a controversial opinion, but I don't think people should be waltzing in here, never holding elected office before, and say, here, make me head of state. I'm just like, no, like, sorry, it is a political office. I don't care what anyone says. You have to go before the people. I want to see some political pedigree here, you know. So I'm much more comfortable with a former TD or a senator or whatever seeking this office than someone who's just walked in off a GA pitch. Like, great, you kicked the football around, that's class, but you know what you know about the constitution, you know.
You know, Marv, I actually couldn't agree with you more on that. And I think that it kind of, in this election, it's kind of been the first one that we've seen the whole constitution and, you know, how parties can block people from running and stuff. I think we were going to touch on this in a little bit, but it is quite topical. Like, I know the Maria Steen kind of issue. You know, she left her campaign too late, and as you mentioned, she could have got in the county council route and the city council route if she really wanted, but it was left too late. She got 18 signatures, which was far more than I thought she'd get in 13 days. And out of that 13 days, you know, I heard she had a bereavement and stuff. During that time, she couldn't attend a couple of councils. But, you know, at the end of the day, the only reason that Jim Gavin was nominated to run for president was because he's buddies with Micheál Martin. That is essentially it. And, you know, even though Billy Kelleher managed to get 29 out of, and Jim Gavin got 41 votes, that's still too close to comfort, you know. And if Jim Gavin performs badly, he may, you know, voter turnout might not be great in this election. I've chatted to a good few young people, and a lot of them, not only do they not know who to vote for, they don't even know if they will vote, you know. But I do think that it will or could be crucial for Micheál Martin that if Jim Gavin does not do well, you know, there might be questions over his leadership. And I think he should have taken the step and went for it, you know, because he would have been a great president as well.
It's the same with Sinn Féin, where I think the whole reason why Catherine Connolly has in any way of a fighting chance is because Sinn Féin have backed her, but they've backed her way too late, I think. It looks indecisive. It's clearly obvious they wanted a big name, a so-called game changer, who I say must have been Mary Lou. Surely it was Mary Lou MacDonald, and we talked about it here, it made a lot of sense, and I think she definitely could have swept the power if she had put her name on the ballot, but she didn't. I don't know, just Sinn Féin are looking a bit weird as well, kind of indecisive. Like, I thought this one was on a play for Fine Gael if they ran someone decent, and they've never won the presidency before. I'm looking at Heather Humphreys, and again, I'm thinking, yeah, she has a pretty good CV if she can, if she can stand over all the government's record. And I actually think her Protestant heritage is a great advantage to her as well. I'm not a fan of people having a go at her with some familial links to the Orange Order. That's the reality of Ulster Protestants. That's the way it is.
If you want to unite Ireland, you have to have that debate and you have to be inclusive. Yeah.
1/3 of the flag is orange. That's the way it is. We've orange marches in Monaghan and Donegal every year, and it's fine. You know, it's a republic. It's, you know, that's the way we are. But yeah, again, it is going to be interesting. These ones are always interesting. There's always something mad happens, you know. So we'll see.
Yeah, so we had the Sean Gallagher thing in 2011 with the envelope, you know, and the Twitter gate and stuff like that.
And there could be something in 1990.
Yeah, and there could be something like Flaggate here, you know, with the Irish flag or something. Somebody could say the wrong thing. But, you know, it's actually quite interesting that you mentioned Brian Lenihan, because I think it could be a repeat of that. But instead of Mary Robinson not getting the most first preference votes but winning on Austin Curry's transfers, I think that could happen to Heather Humphreys. Because if Jim Gavin doesn't perform well, you best believe a lot of them transfers are going to Heather Humphreys, especially in the rural counties, you know. 100%. And Jim Gavin's votes aren't just coming from Dublin, you know. There is a Fianna Fáil, the strongest base voting wise in the country. We saw that in the general election. You know, we were looking at every constituency, and they have such a foundation of councillors, and they just have, like, they're just a political machine, you know, and they always go out to vote for their own, you know. So all it will take is a bit of manoeuvring and a bit of loyalty to the Civil War parties, and those transfers will go to Heather Humphreys. Like, unless Catherine Connolly has a fairly decent advantage in terms of first preference votes, I think she might get nipped on the line, which will make it very interesting.
It'll be, Connolly's going to need a serious first preference vote, and Humphreys is going to probably have to tank. Something bad's going to have to happen to her. But other than that, I can foresee, as you've predicted, Humphreys either Humphreys first with first preferences followed by Connolly and then Gavin's second preference elects, or like Connolly first and Humphreys just slightly behind and then Gavin's second preferences, something like that. Yeah, which again, just like the 1990, except now Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are transferring to each other, so that's the difference. But it will be a similar format, I definitely think. Yeah, that's the way it's going to be.
Yeah, they're just returning the favor. And I'll say one more thing just about the kind of presidential debate and the whole process. And we might have another conversation again about, does the constitution need updating, or should we make it more inclusive or more accessible for people who want to run for presidency? Because I feel like we do have a serious lack of candidates, especially representing young people. But I'll ask you this: what do you think of the kind of growing trend that's going around, and certain politicians are telling people to write Maria Steen on their ballot, or spoil your vote or stuff like that? What do you think of that?
That's just absolute utter yank stuff. Like, honestly, it's, I thought we were getting them out after their NFL matches. Like, come on, like, that is just absolute American. No, like, again, I think we have a process. Yeah, sure, we can talk about it, but it's a 7-year cycle. There's local elections last May. There's general elections last November. If it's, and this is a representative democracy. These are the people's representatives vetting the candidates, putting them on the ballot, and then it's us, the electorate, who have the final say. So the reason why there's no hard right candidate on the ballot is because there's not enough hard right councillors or TDs elected last year, and that's just kind of the way it is. At least that's my view anyway. Now, look, she could have got on Maria Steen. I know Michael McDowell held pretty firm, and there were one or two others, but they would turn around and say, "Oh, well, we were getting berated online by people being stirred up by her supporters and all that kind of stuff," and just basically blaming that this a growing trend of like negativity in politics. I know Simon Harris got a death threat there recently, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just reflecting the modern world we're living in. There's a lot more kind of, I would say, imported stuff from America and probably Britain as well. That's a lot more divisive, a lot more kind of hardcore. Not really part of our culture, I think. Well, yeah, if we can have a discussion about amending the constitution, but I think if you're going to just go turn up and spoil your ballot, you might as well not go, because you're not going to impact anything really, I think, materially.
Yeah, it's good. And look, if you really want to protest with a vote, what you do is you go out and vote for a candidate that you believe in, and if it's not this election, do it in the next one. Spoiling the vote will do absolutely nothing. It's pathetic if you ask me, But I do think that our constitution might have to be looked at in the future. And I think, like, if you look at examples like Finland and Austria, I know they use certain, I think it's like if you get a certain amount of signatures, it's either like 10,000 or like less than 10% of the population or 5% of the population or something like that, you can get on the ballot sheet. I think as well, if you could get like, let's say 150 councillors to back you instead of just like 20 Oireachtas members or something like that, because I know but as we saw here, Simon Harris deliberately was blocking people from running. Now, I know Fianna Fáil kind of did it as well, but Simon Harris was out front and centre, deliberately blocking candidates, which I don't like, and I think that is undemocratic in itself. But, Maria Steen, you go back to that whole debate and that argument. As we said, if she really wanted to get on the ballot sheet, I'd say she probably would have been able to. And I actually don't agree that if your politics doesn't align with Maria Steen, and if you're an Oireachtas member, I don't think you should be forced to give your signature to her. I respect Michael Healy-Rae giving his signature and coming out saying he's voting for Heather Humphreys. That's perfectly fine. And he wouldn't be too far off for it, politically. If Heather Humphreys probably wasn't running, I'd say that would be his next preferred choice. You wouldn't see Richard Boyd Barrett backing her, you wouldn't expect him to back her, And I think that's the whole point of it, You have the choice to make. You're a representative. You're representing the people who elected you. You're going to make decisions on their behalf. But I think the whole reason this has been highlighted is because of the parties are blocking, and that's a big issue, But there could be another thing said for Sinn Féin and stuff. Sinn Féin have been since 2020. They've been one of the most popular parties in Ireland ever. The amount of votes they've garnered over the last two elections and they couldn't even come forward with a candidate. So that's leaving a massive vacuum there of about 30% of the vote.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why, again, if they had a run, Connolly's whole chances depended on their support. She needed them, you know, and because I think the only show in town was Mary Lou. They were talking about Pierce Doherty for ages. Why would you want to send him to the Oris like at this time? Surely he's someone you want in your cabinet if they do get
for the
into
next
government.
20 years, like, you know.
Yeah,
And
it's ridiculous.
did you see Pat the Power, Ivan Yates, and was talking about the game changing candidate, you know, and they went back and looked at Jarlath Burns and how Jarlath Burns, you know, had this thing called Game Changers, and it was like this kind of campaign in the GAA and stuff like that. And they were like, and this podcast came out literally like, I'd say about 16 hours before they announced that they were back in Catherine Connolly. And Virgin Media were like, yep, Gavin Riley was like, yep, I don't think they're actually, with the language they used, I think they're just going to back Catherine Connolly. But they could have waited a day and just like knew, but they spent like a chunk of that podcast talking about Jarlath Burns. He's gone to 7-1 in the bookies. He knows people he's ringing, like he uses all his connections on the ground, and they're all saying, you know, it could be Jarlath Burns, but I don't ever think was good. Like if you come out and say you're not going to run, you know, you're not running, like that's the end of it.
Yeah. But see, Mary Lou McDonald said that like in April, I'm not running, and then in June she says, I'm thinking about, or I'm weighing up my options or something. So she ruled herself back in. But like, I think it's obvious she never wanted it, but it was kind of like, it was just the polite way to get her out of the party leadership. Because I think, let's be honest, they need her gone. Like, I don't think you can lead.
Yeah, and sure, look, that won't be a conversation for today or tomorrow, you know. It might be 2029 when we're doing that podcast, you know. But sure, you know, until then, we're just going to have to see how the presidential election goes from now to then. But I'll end it on this, Marv. If the presidential election was today, the votes are cast, who do you think is winning the election as it currently stands? There you go. You heard it here first, 30th of September. The prediction is out. So thanks everyone for listening again, and we'll keep you up to date with anything that happens coming up in the presidential election.